Fuck HIPAA. We are an old patient just trying to kidnap me, and it's even more powerful than it sounds.
DisastrousInvolvedI.
Disclaimer, the content presented in this video is purely fictional and intended for entertainment purposes only. In 1346, a bizarre theater troupe rose to notoriety along the Italian peninsula. Contemporary accounts of their performances strain modern credulity. Claims include advanced pyrotechnics, reality-defying stunts, extraordinarily well-crafted set pieces that the troupe routinely left behind to serve as shelter for local beggars, wild animals that even the most educated spectators could not name, and other elements that earned the troupe myriad accusations of witchcraft. The performances were so controversial and the players themselves under such heavy suspicion that arrest warrants were issued for members of the troupe in October 1347. Within days of the warrant's issuance, however, vermin carrying the bubonic plague arrived on ships inbound from Crimea and swiftly devastated the region. Records indicate that the troupe was similarly devastated, leaving only 4 survivors, the playwright of the troupe and his 3 children. Reports that the troupe reformed began to circulate in 1348 with the playwright as the head. Interestingly, these reports indicate that all new members of the troupe were children. Despite the young age of its members, the troupe gave performances as intricate and awe-inspiring as before. They were on the verge of success, and close to earning the ire of the church and government authorities yet again, when the troupe fell victim to a second wave of the plague. Months later, the troupe apparently reformed a third time. The playwright, who was recognizable due to his unusual height and striking red hair, was seen advertising a new performance throughout the city square. He successfully drew an audience for a performance that night. No one knows what the performance entailed, because every last member of the audience vanished. The following night, the playwright was seen advertising a second show alongside a particularly ragged little girl. Once again, they successfully drew a small crowd for the night's performance. Once again, every patron vanished. This continued for a total of 6 nights. Over the course of the show's run, a total of 407 people vanished. The playwright and his troupe were never seen again. As it turns out, the playwright is none other than inmate 17, Ward 1, the Harlequin. For additional context on this inmate, please view his primary file and his secondary file. The events outlined above were entirely unknown to staff at AHH NASCOOP prior to the afternoon of January 19, 25, when the inmate insisted on an impromptu meeting with the agency's specialized interviewer, Rochelle B. That's me. I would like to note that immediately following this interview, the inmate tried to kidnap me, and I believe his reason for doing so directly relates to the information he shared with me during the below interview, in order to most accurately describe the events as they unfolded. I've transcribed the inmate's interview first, and my direct related experience with him afterward. I would also like to note that I am still scared as all hell and will not be talking to this inmate again under any circumstances. Interview subject: the Harlequin, classification string, uncooperative/indestructible/Olympic/protean/critical/egregore. Interviewers: Rochelle B. Christoph W. Interview date: January 19, 2024. When I love, I become weak. This is why I enjoy everything while loving nothing. Unfortunately, love sometimes comes for you whether you want it or not. After I was exiled from my own city for the first time, it came for me, and a long time ago, I fell in love with a theater troupe. So I joined them. I was never in charge of the troupe, but I should have been because I did all the work. I built the sets and painted them. I set up the scenery and props and took them down. I stitched disparate pieces of dusty, musty fabric into costumes, then broke them back down to reconstitute into entirely different costumes later. I sang. I danced. I acted. Most importantly, I wrote the plays, and I did all of it with skill, speed, power, and efficacy that no one but me could ever match. Because of me, our shows became legendary. I won't bore you with a description of those details. I'll show them to you later. You'll love it, trust me. Now, there was money in theater back then. I wouldn't have done it otherwise, not even for love. But there wasn't much money, even for legendary performers, and after the profits were distributed among the troupe each night, we all somehow felt poorer than we had that morning. Theater wasn't respectable in those days, nor was it acceptable. That's part of why I loved it. Theater was often work of last resort. A vocation of desperation, like any lowly occupation that the public sneers at for no good reason. The people who flocked to the theater were lost. Orphans, criminals, cripples, whores, thieves, runaways, me. All of us were lost until we found each other. Once found, we looked out for each other. We weren't kind. I won't pretend otherwise. No matter what anyone tells you, kindness does not lend itself to survival. But community does. We all needed to survive, so we made ourselves a community. Community is the truest form of light. I hate the dark in all its forms. I fear it. I despise it so much I made sure darkness could ever enter my own city. I am a being of light, therefore, I am a being of community, and trust me, you will never find a community quite so tightly knit as a community of lost people who have been forced to find each other. Once found, we work together. Performance was our work, I loved it. Performance is the one true art that serves everyone in everything. It is also necessary for survival. Every last one of us puts on a performance every moment of every day unless we are extraordinarily lucky. We accept this about ourselves. We accept that we must perform to belong, but we don't accept this about others. In fact, we punish others for performing every chance we get. For some reason, punishing others for engaging in the very same survival strategy we do bolsters our own sense of superiority, yet there are people who, through luck or lack of learning or sheer exhaustion or outright rebellion, simply cannot perform to the standard society requires. There are other people who refuse entirely. There are more, many more, who perform admirably every minute of their lives until their mask cracks for reasons beyond their control. Revealing them for what they truly are, in my experience, what they truly are is every bit as beautiful and worthy as their performance. Unfortunately, society has a tendency to see things differently, and we all must exist within society. Ironically, the people who cannot, or can no longer, or simply do not want to perform in the day-to-day are the best performers the stage, and screen, for that matter, will ever see. My troupe who I loved was no exception. My troupe taught me many things. The most important is that talent makes or breaks a troupe. The talent of the unit is as vital as the talent of the individual. The second most important thing is that the most extraordinarily talented people are often the ones no one looks at twice. I loved unearthing talents to look at twice. I suppose you would describe me as a scout. I checked the streets and the alleys, the churches and the orphanages, the whorehouses and the pastures for people who were as talented as they were lost. I specialized in people who had been abandoned. Not for any dangerous or self-serving reason, but because the abandoned are the most lost. I know this because I was abandoned long, long ago. When I want to be, I'm very charismatic. Whether I want to be or not, I'm highly domineering. No matter what, I am the strongest thing I know. This made me an exceedingly successful scout, so successful, in fact, that in combination with my soft spot for the lost and abandoned, my troop soon had too many people to utilize. Infighting began, and it was wholly dramatic. Wholly. As I told you, kindness does not lend itself to survival. With too many people and too few parts to play, kindness ceased to exist. To quell the conflict, I decided to write extra plays. Enough for each and every person to have a starring role. I thought it made sense. More plays, more performances, more money. The man who ran the theater troupe did not agree. He claimed it was too much to memorize, too many sets to build, too much work. This was entirely unfair, given that I did most of the work while he collected most of the money. He did not agree with my perspective, and insisted on firing half the troupe. I took the fired half and made my own new, better troupe, and of course, I continued my scouting activities. One day, I found a green-eyed child with the most hideous patchy hair. I could see the bugs crawling on her scalp as clearly as the bruises mottling her skin. She was absolutely frightful in every way, but she was the truest talent I have ever seen. The only thing standing between us was the woman who put those bruises on her skin in the first place. I got rid of her, and brought the child into my community. Into my light. Her talent soon outshone even my expectations, so I immediately wrote a play specially for her. The rest of the troupe was so very angry, right up until she began to perform. When they saw her in action, every last one of them fell into awed silence. I knew then that I had struck gold, so special was she that I adopted her. She became my first child. Now, to be fair, the theater is no place to raise a child. None whatsoever, at least not back then. The business was cutthroat, the streets dangerous, the venues themselves dilapidated fire traps. We performed for the working classes when we could, and were lucky to complete a performance before the church or the authorities drove us off. Mostly we performed in the slums. I can still taste the despair, thick and cloying, coating my throat. A true miasma. I told you that we who were lost until we found each other built a community. A community is necessary for survival, but it isn't always enough to live. Our days were defined by sickness, anger, and scarcity. We had little food and less money. I had to comfort the children often, and sometimes the adults too. More than once I woke in the night to one of the actresses sobbing into her pillow. Her story was so sad. Most of their stories were so sad. Even my story was sad. It's a wonder we all didn't cry more. As I told you, a vocation of desperation. but our luck finally seemed to turn with the season, especially with my raggedy green-eyed little find as headliner. She was a terrible child, but a very good girl. She called me Papa when she wanted something from me, then kicked me when I didn't give it to her. I would then threaten to poke out her eyes, after which she would threaten much worse. Then I'd laugh and give her what she asked for in the first place. How could I not? She was my daughter, and she was extraordinary. She had such an effect on the audiences that I knew I had to find more like her, and I did. I searched among the lost, the battered, and the broken for more extraordinary children. It was so easy. They came to me just as I came to them. We often claim that opposites attract, but in my experience this is one of the least true things on earth. Like attracts like because we long for others like ourselves. But so many of us either don't like ourselves or simply aren't honest with ourselves, so most of us convince ourselves otherwise. I am not most of us, neither were my children, that is why we found each other. Before I knew it, I had 3 extraordinary children of my very own, all of whom called me Papa when they wanted something and kicked me when I didn't give it to them. None were quite as talented as my frightful little green-eyed beast, but they were close. Every last one of them was so close. So special, so capable, so worthwhile. Yet they had been thrown away. The world's loss, and my gain, just as we began to succeed, just as I had finally begun to make the things I love as strong and safe as the plague came. It came for the entire troupe. I loved them so much that I made myself their caretaker. I held the crying actress as she choked on her own effusions. She cried for her mother, who had abandoned her. I didn't cry for her mother, but I did cry for her. She was only the first. Within days, all were ill except my 3 children. I couldn't bring myself to hold them all as they cried and choked on their own dissolving lungs. Not because I didn't love them, but because I loved them so much the pain was unbearable. I am monstrous when I am in pain, so I gathered my 3 extraordinary children and fled the city. We held out as long as we could. The plague-stricken landscape baking under the flat bright sun is something I will never forget. Not because it frightened me but because of how badly it frightened them. The heavy, sweet stench of corpses smells wafting from cottages and farmhouses, bloated livestock rotting in the pastures, flocks of carrion fat crows so thick they blocked the sun. There was no food, no safety, only disease everywhere we looked. I was sustained. Entertainment has always done that. It feeds me the way food feeds you. But my frightful children who I barely loved were starving, and there was nothing I could do. After the disease ravaged everything and moved on, we returned to the city. My troupe was dead, bodies still decaying exactly where I'd left them. They were gone where even I could not find them. Deep into the vast dark that I fear above all, but there were new lost children everywhere. Some were orphans, some victims, some abandoned, some maimed, some mad, all of them alone and all of them lost. I found them, I took them in and I taught them to build and break down sets, to paint the scenery and stitch disparate pieces into costumes in ways easy to undo, to sing and dance and act. But I didn't teach them to write. Children are terrible writers, particularly of plays. I wrote the plays and they did the rest. We put on shows, picked the pockets of our patrons, and prowled the crowds to steal from bystanders. We had no choice. I had to do something to supplement our income from the theater. After all, I had so many mouths to feed, so many children came to me. You cannot imagine. Most of them were not talented, but that wasn't their fault so I kept them. However, a very few among them were exceptionally talented. They were also the most lost, the most broken, and in their various ways the most loving. I adopted them too. In all, I had 6 children that I called my own. The best of them was still the frightful little green-eyed girl who I despised almost as much as I loved. But that was all right. The rest didn't have to be the best. As with everything, theater falls apart if you only make room for the best. You need great and you need good and you need passable and you need bad just as much as you need best. I had all of these in my troupe. They made my life a nightmare, but a worthwhile and enjoyable one. I liked all of the children. I protected them, I fed them, and I disciplined them, sometimes harshly, sometimes overly harshly. I wasn't always wonderful, but I was always there. That was more than most of them had ever had. I admit I let it go to my head. I have always let things go to my head. It's easy to do when you are the strongest and most powerful thing any place you go. Now, I wanted to spoil my children. The best, the great, the good, the passable, and the bad altogether. They had all suffered so much, sometimes by my own hand, and still worked so hard. They deserved a reward. They deserved to have what they wanted, and what they all wanted was a home, so I rewarded them with a tiny city of their very own. I built it myself in a little cove by the river. I began with humble intentions. Something akin to a playhouse, only marginally better than the sets I designed for our performances, but then I caught my frightful green-eyed daughter studying me as I worked. Asking to help. Wanting to learn from me. My extraordinary child, being as extraordinary as ever, and I knew that she needed something every bit as extraordinary as she. I was taught long ago that love dims what I can do. It weakens everything I am. It renders me almost powerless. Nothing I had seen or experienced made me believe differently. Until the night my daughter helped me build our home, for the first time in all time, love made me stronger, and so, for the first time in all time, I was able to make magic for what I loved, the other children, the best, the great, the good, the passable, and the bad, all helped. Together, we built our home, an astonishingly perfect tiny city made beautiful by own prodigious skill, and made even lovelier by the myriad shortcomings of its child artisans. They stole candles and lanterns to light each corner of our little city. Too many candles, too many lanterns, too much light. How it glowed in the night, so beautiful and bright, all the children loved our little city. My favorite daughter who I did not like loved it so much she wrote a song for it. Children are not any better at writing songs than they are at writing plays, but she surprised me. I shouldn't have been surprised. She was so extraordinary, after all, and so was her song, a low, haunting little melody just a shade too melancholy to be a lullaby. She called it To the City Bright. I told her well done, but not before I gave her suggestions for improvements. Artists must always strive for improvement. I would have failed in my duties as a father had I not imparted this to her. Even though we had a home, they were still hungry. In the aftermath of the plague, there was so much less than there had been before. Fewer patrons, smaller audiences, little to no money. I did not need food. Our performances sustained me. But they did not sustain my children, who grew more desperate by the day. Children, hungry children especially, hungry broken children most especially, are even less kind than adults, and far less capable of understanding that community is the key to survival. They were at each other's throats every second of every day. It was maddening, but it was entertaining too. And it was inspiring. So inspired that I wrote a play based on their ridiculousness. I had never had so much fun writing anything. I wasn't entirely sure who would want to watch this play, but I was excited to write it. And my own excitement mattered more to me than the opinions of as yet unmaterialized audience. In fact, I was not nearly as excited about an audience as I was about watching my children rehearse. I hoped that being confronted with their own ridiculousness would prompt introspection and improvement. I didn't believe it would, but I hoped. And if those hopes went unfulfilled, so what? I would laugh at them anyway. I told you, kindness is not vital to survival. On the night I finished this play, I gathered my children round and had them read it. I was roaring with laughter by the end of the first act. None of the children were laughing. Some were crying for their hurt feelings, others were embarrassed. Most were angry. My frightful ragged green-eyed girl kicked me, which made me laugh the more, and that made her laugh. In a short moment, the rest were laughing too. We fell asleep laughing. The very next morning, my youngest son woke with sick lungs and abscesses on his arms. The plague had come again, this time for my very own children. I did everything I could. I used all of my power to save them. When that failed, I pulled my power out of myself and gave it to them. Nothing worked. All of them died. My favorite daughter who I almost hated died last. I rocked her as she faded, singing To the City Bright while tears streamed down my face. I told her it was a perfect song that needed no improvements. When she was gone, I tore the little city we had built to the ground. I don't remember feeling anything as I rampaged. No anger, no despair, no sadness. But I remember crying. Once destroyed, I noticed my play in the wreckage. The one that was so mean it made my children cry, and so funny they laughed so long and so hard that they cried again. Just looking at it was enough to conjure them in my mind's eye. I settled down among the ruins of my city and began to read my play. For a little while, I could almost believe my children were back with me. I could see them. The words evoked them so perfectly, all their little mannerisms and speech patterns, all their silly movements and idiosyncrasies and endless whining. I never thought I would grieve the loss of a child's whine. But I grieved for it that night with my whole heart. When I finished reading the play, I went back to the beginning to start again. This time I read the lines aloud in my children's voices. Not just mimicking them, but transforming myself into them. Bringing them all back to me for a little while. Whenever I paused to turn the page, I'd laugh or sometimes cry. For many days, I lay among the ruins of our bright little city and read and reread the play until I had it memorized. But with each reading, my evocation grew weaker. As though the memories were a well that was drying up. It was too much to bear. So one night I set the play aside in a safe place, precious thing that it was, and I performed it from memory all by myself, there among the ruins of our little bright city, and in the middle of the first act, my favorite daughter crawled out of the wreckage and began to say her lines, the rest came after her, shimmering into being in darkness that had once been so bright, they paid no attention to me. They only recited their lines, I tried to touch them, but my hands went right through them, I screamed at them, I laughed, I threw things, I tried to shove them. I ran right through them. No matter what I did, they did not see me. They weren't real, or maybe I wasn't real, maybe none of were, whatever the truth, we were apart. Even though they looked as real as anything has ever been, they were beyond my reach, all I could do was watch them, so I did, night after night, I summoned my children to watch them perform, on the seventh night, I had a dream. I don't remember the dream. I never remember my dreams. I hope I never will, but I woke up with a purpose, why would my children stay after their performance? They had nowhere to be. No home to stay in. I had destroyed it, so I rebuilt the city, piece by piece, exactly as I remembered. Right down to the myriad imperfections of my child artisans, when it was done, I stole candles and lanterns and lit every corner of it until the structure blazed with light, blinding gold against the night, then I strode into the very center and began to read our play. Before the opening monologue was complete, they crawled and trundled from the 6 doorways surrounding and began to perform. This time I could touch them, but they still didn't notice me, they recited their lines even when I touched their hair, tugged their costumes, knocked them down, or dragged them off stage. Nothing I did stopped or even interrupted their impeccable line delivery, when the performance concluded. They linked hands and bowed. Then they split into 6 little lines, each of which exited through a different little door, this had never happened before. At the conclusion of the play, they simply glimmered out of being the way they glimmered into it, like the stars at dawn, my little green-eyed monstrosity exited last. I crawled after her, yelling her name. She paid no attention as she vanished through the door, she kicked it shut, but I caught it just before it latched and threw it open, before me was a vast, shining darkness. A glimmering void begging for light. I tried to go inside, but it was like pressing against a glass wall, I called my daughter's name. I called all of their names. Nothing answered but an echo of my own desperate voice, once I'd screamed myself hoarse to no result, I checked the other doors. They opened onto the little enclosed city streets, just as they were supposed to. No voids. No darkness. Only bright, beautiful streets sized for broken extraordinary children. The next day, I read my cursed play again. Just like before, the children entered through the 6 little doors and commenced their performance. At the end, I followed my youngest son, the one who died first, to the second door. I caught it an instant before it latched, and tried to go in. Once again it was as though I was up against an invisible, impenetrable wall. Through the doorway I saw full black darkness without even a shimmer. Only emptiness. The worst, most monstrous kind of emptiness. The idea of my children being trapped there drove me to a frenzy. I hurled myself against the invisible wall, desperate to go after them. To find them. To bring them back home into the light. I couldn't. The next day, I followed my 3rd child through the 3rd door, catching it an instant before it latched. Through the doorway was darkness again. But it was a different kind. It was alive, undulating, pulsing. This time I passed through the doorway, and immediately flipped upside down and began to fall. By instinct, I grabbed the darkest part of the darkness. It scorched my skin, raising blisters that made me scream. I knew, somehow, that I was clinging to what remained of a corrupt and dying star. Something that had decided to eat light instead of give it. As I looked up and saw the 3rd doorway spilling its meager square of light into that living, terrible dark, I knew the star was trying to reach it. That it would try to squeeze through. To break in and devour the light of my little city and all the light that lay beyond. I crawled up, screaming as my scorched and blistered skin sloughed off, and reached the little door. I climbed through and slammed it shut just as the darkness began to bleed through. I fear darkness. I hate it. I always have. That is why I made the city bright. I did not want my children to live in the dark. On the 4th night, I went to the 4th door. Beyond it was the darkest water I have ever seen. Within it flickered a behemoth like a shark made of nightmares and rot, with a shimmering, hypnotic pattern of dimmest light dancing across its awful skin. I tried to follow, because at least there was a hint of light. But I couldn't, no matter what I did, I couldn't, not through any of them. The next night I tried the 5th door. The night after that, the 6th. I won't tell you what lay behind them. It is too terrible even for me to relate to you. 6 doors, 6 paths, each of them closed to me. My children lay beyond them, trapped in eternal hungry darkness and me too weak to follow. I was a father too useless to protect the only things I had ever promised to protect. On the night I tried the sixth door, I had another dream that I do not remember, and once again, I woke with a purpose. That very morning, I went around the city advertising the performance of a lifetime. Hyperbole, yes. But I was desperate, and the crowds were gullible, small, but eminently gullible. It was easy to lure them to my show. They watched the performance with bright, shining eyes and awestruck smiles. When my children gave their final bow and crawled off stage, I made the audience follow my green-eyed little horror through her door. It was easy. The audience wanted to follow her. After all, she was the best performer. Everyone wants proximity to the best. None of the audience hit an invisible wall. Perhaps that is the privilege of humanness, I wouldn't know, and I no longer care. Moments after the last spectator vanished into the darkness, a pair of dear, familiar little hands shot out of the dark and gripped the doorway. I grabbed them and pulled. My green-eyed daughter emerged, scared and skinny and so very extraordinary. Her less extraordinary siblings who had followed her through the door came after her. The great, the good, the passable, and the bad. I welcomed them all, laughing and crying. Once they were all out, I held my green-eyed daughter all night. Weeping joyfully as she hurled insults told me to shut up so she could sleep. The next day, we all went out into the city to advertise a wonderful and wondrous one-of-a-kind show. Once again, the audience came, small but gullible. Once again, they watched the performance with awe and happily followed the performers through the little door into the vast hungry dark. Once again, after the last scream faded, a set of dear little hands slapped the doorframe. Once again, I hauled my child out of the dark and into the light. Once again, his lesser brothers and sisters followed. The next day, we all went into the streets to advertise a performance such as the world had never seen. It was an exaggeration, of course, but exaggeration is the essence of entertainment. Once again, the audience came. Less small this time, but just as gullible. This is how I rescued my dead children and their brothers and sisters, by feeding the hungry dark so much it had no choice but to vomit them back into the light. The crowd swelled. So did our earnings. So did my troupe. Soon, I had all my children back. We were happy. We were family. We were a troupe. I loved them. My love for them anchored me. It trapped me. It made me weak. I hate being weak. All monsters despise weakness. I am no different, but I thought my weakness would save them until I was no longer exiled from my city bright. Until I could bring them there with me, my weakness did not save anything, especially not them. Over the years, they all died again, some of illness, some of accidents, some of stupidity, some of hatred, some of pain. Alone of them, my green-eyed daughter who I almost hated died of old age. Bring me back again, Papa, she told me with her last breath. Like you did before. Please. I tried even harder to bring her back than I'd tried with the others, but no matter how many plays I wrote or read or memorized or performed, no matter what I built or destroyed or rebuilt, no matter what I tried or what I did or who I tore apart or who I sacrificed, nothing brought them back. Not even her. My love destroyed me for a very long time. When I finally rebuilt myself, I went back and reclaimed my city bright, not for my benefit, but for my children. I hate the dark. I despise it. I fear it. That is why I made sure not a drop of darkness could survive in my city, and I was so glad. My children suffered enough in the dark. I knew they would never have to suffer the dark again. Once I returned to my city, once I made myself stronger than I had ever been. No, I will not tell you how I did it. You are the last person who should learn how to be stronger. I went into the dark and found my youngest son. The one who died first, and then I brought him into my city bright, where he immediately died a third time, screaming in my arms. I knew, then, that I had made an enormous mistake. Death is darkness, although I saved my children from the dark. It touched them. It wormed its way into the bones and blood. No darkness can ever exist in my city bright. I made it that way, because I hate the dark. My first children were all infected with darkness. If I could go back, I would allow a little darkness. Only a tiny bit. Just enough to let my first children in. I told you I don't remember my dreams. That's a lie. I have nightmares. I dream of the ravenous darkness in which I lost my children. I dream of their fear and their pain. I dream of coming so close to rescuing them, only to be eaten by the dark myself. I never even get to dream of bringing them back. If I do, I don't remember. I find that cruel. That's all my frightful daughter wanted. For her papa to bring her back. I couldn't do that for her. Wherever she is now, I know she's very angry at me for denying her. sometimes I feel her kicking me. I have already promised myself that I will never give you cause to kick me. If you're new here, this is going to make no sense. It might not even make sense if you're not new. Either way, I'm sorry. The second those words left the Harlequin's mouth, he lunged across the table and dragged me under. Everything was utterly wrong. The floor beneath was somehow stretched to an impossibly far horizon. The table itself looked like it was 100 feet overhead. Dust clusters the size of small cars loomed in the distance. It was far too big, far too cold, and far too bright. The Harlequin's hand crushed my shoulder as he dragged me forward. His body was doing something sinuous and hideous, a powerful, boneless movement that I couldn't quite wrap my head around. At the very end of the floor, how was it so far away? Was a band of blinding, brilliant light. Even from a distance, it was so painful I squeezed my eyes shut. He dragged me right up to the edge. For an awful second, I was sure he was going to throw me in. Look, he said. I couldn't. Even with my eyes closed, it was so bright I was viscerally terrified it would burn my eyes out. Look. He tried to force my eyes open, long thick fingers pinching my eyelids.
Oh my God, you guys, I can't believe it.
I can't.
There's actually something here.
I screamed, you have to look. It's the only way to see which mind you're in. All my other children looked, he said. Why won't you, darling girl? Because I'm not your darling girl. I kicked away. He let me. Keeping my eyes shut, I spun around and crawled in the opposite direction. I thought it would take forever, but before I knew it someone was pulling me to my feet and shoving me as far away as the room allowed. Christoph, of course. Who else would it be? The Harlequin was still under the desk, watching me. His face had changed. It was recognizable, and almost his, but terribly, stomach-churningly wrong. I give all my children what they want, he said. Nothing more. And nothing less. That is all I am trying to do for you. You've made me very angry. So angry I don't even want to be your father anymore. But family needs each other, even when they don't want to be family. I need you, and you need me even more. Remember that when I come back, darling girl. With a smile that made me want to scream, he slithered around and vanished into the darkness beneath. The weirdest thing, not the scariest, but the weirdest, is that he apparently slithered through his little wormhole right back into his own cell. As if this wasn't enough stress for one day, I have a meeting with the agency director in less than an hour. He says he's going to show me another one of my creepy employee files. It's safe to say I'm not looking forward to it, not a bit.
Until next time, subscribe to stay up to date with all updates. No screamers or shocking moments, only comfort and safety. Bye.